Welcome to episode 189 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/189. 7 Health is currently taking on new clients, and there are a handful of reasons that clients commonly come and see us. So the first is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is the fancy name for not getting a period. And this is often the result of undereating and overexercising for what the body needs, irrespective of your actual weight. And it's almost always coupled with body dissatisfaction and a fear of weight gain. Disordered eating and eating disorders would be another reason clients commonly come and see us. And we work with clients along the disordered eating and eating disorder spectrum. And sometimes clients wouldn't think to use the term disordered eating to describe themselves, but they see that they're overly restrictive with their eating, with fear around certain foods like bread or carbs or processed foods. They feel compelled to exercise excessively, or they find themselves binging and feeling out of control around food. Moving away from dieting would be another reason, and clients have had years or decades of dieting and they're just realizing it's not working for them, but they're then struggling to figure out how do they live and do food without dieting. So what should they eat? How do they listen to their body? What will become of their weight? Like, they're confused and overwhelmed and scared and just trying to figure out what to do. And then the final one would be body dissatisfaction and negative body image. So many of our clients have feelings of body shame and hatred, and they find themselves fixated on weight and determined to be a particular size and just frustrated with what they see in the mirror. And they may even have social events that they opt out of and opting out of photographs and putting off appointments because of their negative body thoughts. And in all of these areas, we're able to help, and we do so by using a combination of understanding physiology and psychology. So understanding how to support the physical body, understanding how the body works, but also being compassionate and understanding how the mind works and uncovering the whys behind clients' behavior so they can figure out how to change this. So if any of these areas are things that you want help with, then please get in contact. You can head over to www.7-health.com/help. And there you can read about how we work with clients and apply for a free initial chat. So the address again, www.7-health.com/help. And I'll also include that in the show notes. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. So let's start the show with our book giveaway. So we're now giving away a book from our resources page with every new episode of the podcast. This week's winner is Kate T. So Kate, we will be in contact with you to send you a book of your choosing. Reviews help to increase the visibility of our podcast and enable us to reach and help more people. And they also give you a chance of winning a book. All you need to do is leave a review on iTunes, take a screenshot of that review and email it to info@7-health.com, and then you will be permanently entered into the draw. So this week on the show, it is a guest interview, and my guest is Glenys Oyston. So Glenys is a registered dietitian who helps people recover from eating and body image issues created by toxic diet culture through the health at every size and intuitive eating philosophies. She is also an advocate for promoting weight stigma awareness and fat positivity, and is the co-host of the popular Dietitians Unplugged podcast. She is based in Los Angeles and sees clients both in person and virtually. And you can find Glenys at darenotTodiet.com. So I've been aware of Glenys for a number of years. I had her Dietitians Unplugged podcast co-host Aaron Flores on the show back in November time. And this episode was actually recorded fairly shortly after Aaron's. It's just taken a while to come out. We've got quite a backlog of episodes. So Glenys runs an online course, or one of the things she does is run an online course for helping people with diabetes from a weight neutral approach. And so I wanted to spend a lot of the time as part of this conversation focusing on that topic, which we do. As usual, I start out by finding out more about Glenys, so her own upbringing and relationship with food and dieting, then her training as a dietitian, which was a second career and happened later in life, before we then move on to the topic of diabetes and cover some of the things that are talked about or focused on as part of Glenys's course, a course that she actually runs with Rebecca Stritchfield, who has also been on the podcast. So as part of it, we talk about what diabetes is, how it's diagnosed, and then how you can manage it without dieting. So that's what's covered. Let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Glenys Oyston. Hey Glenys, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Chris, so much for having me. I feel really honored.
So I've been following your Dietitians Unplugged podcast for a long while now, and I recently did an episode with your co-host Aaron Flores, and we had an awesome conversation. I know we were just talking about this before we hit record, and there's a lot I want to cover with you today. I want to go back through like your childhood and your story and journey to become a dietitian, and also how that's evolved through the years. But also one of the big areas I want to spend a decent amount of time on is the work that you do with diabetes from a non-diet approach, because I think what you're doing in this area is really important work. And so I want to just carve out a chunk of time for us to chat about that. But I guess to start with, are you able to give listeners a bit of background on yourself, like a brief bio of sorts, like who you are, what you do, what training you've done, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Glenys Oyston, and I'm a dietitian, and I live in Los Angeles. I'm originally from Canada, but I've been in California for a long time now. And I became a dietitian about 7 years ago now, and it was a second career for me. And I had long been working on becoming a dietitian, going to school part-time, now I have been a dietitian for a while, which is kind of exciting for me. And I have a private practice in Los Angeles. And as you said, I have a podcast, Dietitians Unplugged, with my co-host, Aaron Flores. And was that brief enough? Do I need to talk more about, what I'm doing? Okay.
That's good. I mean, that just gives people a very good start, just knowing you're a dietitian and what you do, and then we can go through more of it. So let's go back to you as a kid and growing up. Like how was food in your household?
Oh gosh, it's so funny because I've been really thinking about this a lot for a while. I did a great retreat a few weeks ago, and it was for overeating and binge eating, treating people with overeating and binge eating. With Francie White and Anita Johnson, and it was great, and it started making me think about my childhood. And I think that up until the point, I don't remember anything much about eating except that I didn't like Brussels sprouts until the age of 5 or 6, and then my parents became separated. And at that time, I just remember food really suddenly becoming horrible. And I feel terrible saying that because, separated and divorcing parents are just struggling to do their best, right? Yeah. But I realize now that suddenly we had a lot less money to live on. I'm piecing things together sort of as an adult because my mom passed away a long time ago. But, looking back now, she shielded me as much as possible from that. But as a result, only one of us really got regular dinner. And so that was me. And sometimes they were the classic TV dinners that you got heat up in an oven. We didn't even own a microwave oven. I don't even know if they existed at that time. But I don't want to date myself too much. But I just remember eating by myself in front of the TV, and that's really how I grew up eating. And I think my mom felt really bad about a lot of stuff, as moms tend towards a lot of guilt, unfortunately, I think. And dads, I don't want to exclude them from that. But I lived with my mom at the time. So I just remember being, just not liking the food and just being like, ugh, gross TV dinner, and And my mom started being like, is that all you're going to eat? And getting really kind of like annoyed with me that I was kind of being a typical picky child eater. But as a result, she would also be very lax with foods in between meals. So like if I wanted cookies, I could have cookies. If I wanted cake, I could have cake. But it wasn't just one piece of cake for me. It was like a couple of pieces of cake. Or if it wasn't just one or two cookies, I could just have the bag and I would just munch away on a sleeve of cookies. And that was it. And I think what I realized now is that my mom had been a dieter, and I can look at pictures and just think, oh gosh, what was she going through at the time? Because she was really unnaturally thin for her. And I realize now that she had her own dieting history. And I also remember when my parents separated, my mom went on the egg diet. And I don't know what that is, but I just remember her saying the egg diet. And I was thinking that's hilarious.
Yeah.
And like, well, how many eggs a day are we eating here? Just sounds kind of boring. But, you know, I think she was really compensating and for that with me, and probably living through me vicariously to some degree. And so I became this sort of young overeating child where I would just overeat on dessert in between meals and then come to a meal not hungry at all. And I think we both know, like, we both sort of follow that division of responsibility in feeding with from Ellen Satter. It's like, well, that's not the best way to support a child's upbringing with food, right? But again, she's doing her best. So, and I would say I'm thankful that I was never put on a diet, but I did become, whether it was just my own body size that was going to happen, I became a pretty chubby child. And that didn't really have too much impact on me. Like, I wasn't unhappy. And my mom did a really great job of supporting my self-esteem and, you know, your body's fine, don't worry about it kind of thing if kids made fun of it. And it wasn't until I kind of got into high school and I got on the scale when I was 15 or 16, and the doctor said, well, you've gained too much weight. You need to lose weight. And that was like, you know, at that point I kind of knew, like, oh, well, I know I'm bigger, but now it sounds like it's really wrong, right? Like, I was sort of like making it work for myself. And looking back, I actually wasn't very big at all. Again, I'm like a short, chubby person. And I don't know what happened. I think my mom had a stern talking to the doctor after I came home crying because he never mentioned it again. Wow. And you did not want to cross my mother when it came to her child. And, you know, but at that point, then I think I really started to like have some rebellion eating, you know, and learning to feed myself, but not doing it very well at that point in high school. And I got into my early 20s and I still hadn't thought about really seriously dieting. I remember Susan Powter was big in the early 90s. I was like, oh, just eat all the carbs and no protein. Oh, okay, sounds good. Like, give me 2 bagels kind of thing. Just like bad diet advice generally. And, but around that time in my early 20s, my mom got sick and she had cancer. And it was towards the end of her life where I was really, you know, very alone in the world. And I was like, I need to do something to control my world. And that's when I went on my first diet, which was with Weight Watchers. And should say that was my first and kind of only diet. It was just one long, like 16-year diet that more or less worked. And I put worked in quotes because we know, like, we need to really redefine what work means when your whole life is food. It started out really normally. I didn't have to think that much about food. I was actually eating pretty normally. But you know, I learned that if you eat less, you lose weight, and that's just the result. And I kept pursuing that more and more over the 16-year period to the point where I became completely restrictive of everything and trying to be really thin, and my body was so unhappy. And at that time when I was trying that, I was in an unhappy relationship, and I didn't know how to really deal with that. I didn't really understand that that's why I was unhappy. And so there's a trend of me when things are going wrong in my life, I pick up a diet and go for it. But it was during that restrictive time that I decided to become a dietitian. And because I thought, well, diet is in the word, I should do that because it's going to help me think about food 24/7. And I'm so obsessed with food and I can't understand why sometimes I just overeat so much. It was, you know, spoiler alert, it was because I was starving. Yeah. And, you know, I just thought I'm going to become a dietitian. so I was working, so I started to go to school part-time, and it was sort of during those years, it was 2010, and I had my first intro nutrition class, and it happened to be taught by somebody named Linda Bacon, and I didn't know who that was at the time.
That's interesting that you got that as a first intro.
So, I don't know, so lucky or something. I just feel so lucky, but I didn't know who this person was, and the class fit into my schedule. My friend that was also becoming a dietitian that I'd met in school, she was also taking Intro to Nutrition in an evening class with a dietitian who was much more like a traditional dietitian. And so we were able to compare notes all semester. But I would say, like, my first few classes with Linda Bacon, I was like, she keeps saying things like fat's okay, dieting is bad. How am I going to survive this? What is she talking about? I don't believe this. And I would say by the end of the semester, I was sick of counting out my 12 almonds for one Weight Watchers point and starving before lunch. And I was like a total convert because I realized how unhappy I was the way I was eating and living in fear of eating and simultaneously lusting after food and feeling really bad that I had gained a little bit of weight back and how am I going to keep this going? But it was just like, I mean, my mind, my inner turmoil, it was a mess. And this message was like, hey, you know what? It's actually okay to be in a larger body. And I'd never heard that before in my life. And I realized like how much I needed to hear that. And after that, I stopped dieting. I had a total crisis of conscience where I was just like, what am I going to do? Why am I becoming a dietitian? I don't want to help people lose weight because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a dietitian and help people lose weight. And I didn't want to do that anymore because that seemed really ethically wrong. And then I realized like, oh, there's this whole world of health at every size that I can practice in. It's like non-diet. I don't have to talk about diets. I can talk about nutrition without thinking about weight loss or you know, forcing people into this weight loss paradigm. And that was like a huge revelation. And then I thought, well, I don't know how I'm going to get through the rest of my schooling because nobody else thinks this way. But I was wrong because I met a lot of people along the way that did think this way. And you know, flash forward to now, I'm a dietitian with a private practice who helps people with their eating, and I help people stop dieting and you know, any problems that arise from that. And it's really, really gratifying.
Nice. So there's bits of your childhood that I'd love to go back and just find out more about. So I mean, you mentioned about your parents splitting up when you were 5, and obviously that then having an impact on the meals that were then served. So do you remember pre that, like what eating used to be like in your household before it was just you and your mom?
Yeah, I sort of feel like for me, it was a non-event. Like I remember 70s style casseroles. I really have a very strong vision of one casserole that had like, you know, like hot dogs in them. And I'm thinking weird, but also great. You know, like, isn't that fantastic looking? Don't remember if I liked it or not. I just don't remember food being an issue at all. There was a time when my parents split up a bit earlier temporarily, and we went to live with my grandparents. And I don't really remember that at all because I was probably four, yeah. But there are pictures of me, and when we came back from that, I had gained a lot of weight. And what I know now is that my grandmother was also a long-term dieter, but how she showed love was like, here, eat this, eat this. Eat this, you know, all the time. Here's a big, huge bowl of ice cream in the middle of the day, you know, for no reason. And not that there's anything wrong with having ice cream in the middle of the day for no reason, but it was more like it wasn't just one day. It was like all the time. So food for her, I think, was her way of showing love. And so I came back I had gained like a lot of weight over 3 months. And then that sort of, you know, my parents got back together for a while. And then the pictures of me kind of going back to what I'd looked like previously to some degree. So it's great to know that like when you have those periods, like your body just really tends toward your set point, I think, when things are more normal. Yeah. But that's the sort of the only thing I remember yeah, I remember. I feel like food was kind of a non-event. I think I was probably a frustratingly picky eater, but that's true of like a lot of children. I'm an only child, so my mom didn't have experience with other kids.
Yeah.
And I just only remember like I have some vivid memories of food before my parents split up. And one was my mom saying, "Can you just try one Brussels sprout?" And I was like, okay, because I was a good compliant little kid, and I remember eating it and swallowing it, and then it just like projectile vomiting it right back up. And I was never asked to eat Brussels sprouts again. But I do like them now. So if you cook them properly. But yeah, so it was really, I feel like food was just not something I thought about at all. My mom was pretty lax with like if friends were over, they always asked for candies because they knew my mom always had candies.
Okay. And then what about like after they split up, did you ever have a point where you were staying with your dad or seeing your dad? Like how, and if so, how was your eating when that was going on?
I don't think I stayed with my dad until a year or two later when I was a little bit older, and it was, and, I was kind of like a homebody. So like probably disrupting my schedule wasn't the first thing on their list. But yeah, I would stay with my dad, and my dad's a really good cook. I mean, my mom was a terrible cook, unfortunately. I only remember her not liking cooking and like overcooking things. And like TV dinners, like I said, but when she did cook, it would be good. It's just I think she just thought she wasn't going to put on a big production for two people, and one of them probably wasn't eating her, and we also probably didn't have a lot of money. So I remember going to eat with my dad, and that was probably when I would have like the most normal meals, where it's like, well, the adults are just putting food on the table, and you eat it or you don't eat it. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I can figure this out. And it's funny because I don't really remember food so much when I was with my dad. And I think too, the other thing is my mom ended up doing a lot of like short order cooking for me, like, or she'd say like, well, what do you want? And it's like, thinking back, I'm like, Mom, I'm 8. I don't know what the possibilities are. I'm going to say the same thing every time, cake. So I think my mom really struggled with figuring out how to feed a child when we probably didn't have that much money.
Yeah.
I think she really didn't want to waste money on food. And so I sympathize with that. Like, I don't blame her for any of that. You know what I mean? Like, parents are doing the best they can. So, yeah.
And were you, like you said about eating meals in front of the TV, like was that with her next to you, or were you ever having meals together as if like sort of more than just the food as being a meal, but like the shared experience of a meal, or that just didn't really happen?
So I'm going to say that my memory back to 6 years old is pretty dodgy, but I would say most of the time I ate by myself in front of the TV. And I do remember occasionally eating at the table, but less and less as I got older. We had the old TV table or the TV tray, and I was pretty much by myself, I think. And I think she would eat, because I was picky, I think, I'm just guessing now and thinking back, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I think she was eating my leftovers a lot of the time. So it's like she didn't have to cook extra food. And I wouldn't always eat it all, and I think she would probably eat my leftovers, because I don't ever remember food being thrown out.
Okay. And you mentioned
so I was definitely by myself.
Right. You mentioned your mom sort of getting cancer and then passing away, and I'm getting the impression from what you said that a lot of that was you on your own. So your dad wasn't around. You don't have any other siblings. Like what was that like for you? Did you have other support during that time?
Well, let's see. So I was 23 by that point. So, in the early 90s at 23, you were considered fully an adult. I was not close with any of my family, so I didn't really I had no support through that time, actually, looking back, except for my friends. I had really good friends, and I had really supportive friends. So, but, it was sort of like, well, I'm on my own, and I got to pay for an apartment, because I lived at home until my mom passed away, because I didn't want to move away while she was sick.
Yeah.
And so I almost felt like, oh, this is delayed adulthood. And now I'm going to live on my own, and that's okay. And, I'm a bit of a soldier through kind of person, just like stuff it all down, stuff the feelings down and continue on. Not maybe the healthiest model, but it'll get you through a crisis. But yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, I think my dad sort of came more into my life at that point, but we lived a few hours apart still at that time. So it wasn't, it was pretty much just me after that. So,
right.
Yeah.
And you said that obviously dieting is your way of controlling the world or trying to control the world or giving yourself a semblance of control. So when your mom was ill and then she passed away, did your dieting then really ramp up after that?
Not so much then. What happened was, this is about maybe 3 or 4 months before she passed away. She was getting quite sick and I was feeling very depressed and not really understanding why I was feeling depressed. I mean, maybe I guess I knew in a larger way. I feel like I've spent most of my life kind of disconnected from my body and not understanding why I'm feeling certain things. And I mean, maybe that's just youthful folly, but like I'm much more connected and understand why I get sad about things now. But instead of feeling really depressed, what I wanted to feel was like I was doing something somehow or distracted. So I went to my first Weight Watchers meeting, and that, going back to your support question, that was what felt like support to me at the time.
Yeah.
Just being in a group of people. They didn't know what was going on in my life, but that was fine. I didn't need them to know. I just wanted to be around people who felt in a way sort of like I did. And I went to, honestly, that first Weight Watchers meeting was like going to a church or something when you're like really low in your life and you're like, oh, this is amazing. I feel the love, it was, I think it was a small town. It was in the bottom of a church and, there weren't a ton of people there. And, it was just kind of this, and the leader was so nice and comforting. And I was like, okay, well, I'll try this. Let's see how it goes. And to be honest, I'd been overeating so much up until that point that I really didn't have to restrict that much to see weight loss. So what I'm thinking is at that point in my life, I may have been over my set point from like, I was overeating a lot at that time.
Yeah.
And the way I know that is because being done with a meal meant I felt slightly sick. Like that's when I stopped eating, was when it's all gone and I feel a little bit like, oof, I don't feel that well. I feel really distended and overstuffed. Like that was done for me. And so I was learning a whole new level of doneness, which was now you can only eat this much and good luck for the rest of the day kind of thing. But it was also different at the time. It wasn't their point system. It was actually a little more balanced. It was much more like the old diabetes selections where you had like, 5 breads or 5 starches and 4 proteins and 3 fruits and 3 vegetables, something like that. And so you had to really figure out how to distribute that through the day. And that was the first time I'd ever figured that out. So it was this great distraction from the grief that I was going through, which is a little bit sad. I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting a distraction, but I think now it was such misplaced grief. And so because I was in that when my mom passed away, it was just sort of like, it had been she'd been sick for, a few years. So it was, well, it was like, oh, well, I still have my diet thing that's working for me. I'd lost a bunch of weight by that point. And, boys were being much nicer to me now. And, I just had that kind of distraction to keep me going through the whole time. So I didn't have like a total meltdown where I couldn't work. I went right back to work. And boy, I was thinking back now, I was really, really distracting myself a lot. So the diet provided that major distraction to get through that time for me.
Yeah. And it also sounds as though, as problematic as Weight Watchers is, and it's not the ultimate solution, it was potentially better than what you were currently doing and gave you some bits that you maybe even do today that then helped you along that journey.
Yeah, I have really mixed emotions when it comes to Weight Watchers. One, I feel very strongly that they are a diet company and that ultimately they're not helping people's health. But at the same time, back then, so what I probably needed was somebody to teach me, 1, some structure, 2, how to make a meal, 3, how to get in touch with earlier fullness signals, 4, not go past extreme hunger signals. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I probably needed some help with nutrition, but I would have preferred a non-diet dietitian thinking back, but those didn't exist. They may have existed in small numbers in 1994, but, certainly not in a small town. And it taught me meal planning, which I still do. And it taught me how to put together kind of a balanced plate, albeit those were a little small. So there were things that it helped me do. It's just, and I would say initially those early days, I was not restricting. I was really eating like 3 meals and 3 snacks a day. And I didn't have to restrict that much to get results. Also, I was 23. So I feel like, and I'd never dieted before. And so my body was so compliant, and in when I was asking it to do something. So yeah, those are things that I still value and, knowing now. Like I like to meal plan. And I like to have regular meals. So eating before I went to Weight Watchers was chaotic, and after it was more ordered. And I prefer having it a little more ordered. And I think that most people benefit from structure around eating. So there were some good things I got from it. It's just that it taught me that weight loss was the most important result.
Yeah.
And it also taught me during that time that if you're not feeling good about life, you should diet more. So that became my stress response whenever I was feeling insecure about something. Oh, I'm going to get my journal out and start writing my food down more and going to get a little more tight on things. And so I was always trying to like push my weight lower than it was. And that was not a good thing. So, yeah, I have really mixed emotions around it. It was a little bit like a replacement mother.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. You then went on, as you said, to become a dietitian. So had you seen a dietitian at any point along like your journey? So you obviously went to Weight Watchers, but did you ever have individual consults yourself with someone?
No, never. I mean, by that time after the Weight Watchers, I was in the quote unquote normal BMI category. And so nobody was concerned about my eating or my weight. And I grew up without a lot of money. You don't go and pay for that kind of thing. I didn't even know what a dietitian was in my 20s. I didn't learn what a dietitian was until I started getting really obsessive in my 30s about food and restriction and eating. And I started sort of looking around like I really want a different career. I don't like what I'm doing. Just did a lot of office jobs. I was doing event planning at the time, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. I didn't have a degree at that point, so I really wanted to go back and get that. And I don't know how I stumbled along dietitian, but I think I got to eatright.org, which is our, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics website. And, in the quest for finding for sating my food obsession, like that's one of the websites I stumbled on. And I was like, ooh, dietitian, I could probably become a dietitian maybe. And I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to help other people lose weight? And that's when I sort of started to pursue that. And that was in the early 2000s, or 2003.
And you said it took a while to actually complete that because you were doing it part-time. So how many years were you going through the training?
Yeah, I did. I went part-time really slowly for 5 years. I would do 1 or 2 classes a semester, and I was starting from scratch. So I didn't have a previous degree or anything. So I was really starting from scratch as an adult in her 30s. But I always, I also accepted that, I'm a little bit changeable at times. So I was like, maybe I'll change my mind along the way. So I won't go all in. I'll just kind of dabble my way through. And, but I didn't change my mind. I think I tried to at one point, but I didn't.
To what? Do you remember what you wanted to change to?
No, it was something much more nebulous. It was like maybe I'll just get a, liberal arts degree or whatever. And I was working in fundraising, like in development at the time for schools. And I was like, maybe I'll just become like a fundraising officer. And I think, why did I want to do that? Like, I don't want to ask people for money. So, but it was sort of like, oh God, dietitian just seems so far away right now. I have to take chemistry. Are you kidding me? I think it was when I had to take chemistry, I freaked out and was like, I don't know. I'm not going to be able to take chemistry. I hated science in high school, but turns out I like chemistry. So anyway, I forged ahead, and then at some point during that time, I got divorced. I was married and I got divorced. So my extreme dieting did not save that relationship. It turns out. A PSA, losing more weight will not save a relationship that you are not enjoying. So, and then I was with somebody new at that time, and we were together a couple years, and he's like, oh, I'm getting a promotion at work. Listen, why don't you quit your job and go to school full time and get this thing done with? And I was like, wow, great. And I did it. And that's during that time I met Linda Bacon, had a total ideological shift in how I thought about weight and food and eating. And then I finished in 2012, and then did my internship in Los Angeles. I was in San Francisco when I did my schooling, moved to Los Angeles for my internship with the VA, the Veterans Administration, and finished that in 2013. And I guess the rest is history. I hope that answered the question you just asked.
Yeah, it did. It did. And when you were doing your internship, and then as soon as you started as a dietitian, like, were you 100% on board with the Linda Bacon health at every size style of practicing, or was there still some like ambivalence about it and unsureness of maybe I agree with some of this, but some of this I don't necessarily agree with, and maybe I'll do some weight loss, or how were you feeling at that point?
Yeah, no, I was 100% converted. Like, I was like, I don't want to have anything to do with weight loss. It's evil. I was all in at that point. And the nice thing was, like, when I transferred to my 4-year university, I did, a lot of classes at what we call junior college here, and then transferred to a 4-year in San Francisco. And one of the instructors there was also very much a health at every size person. And so she was like, great. She was like a lifeline for me. My close friend that I was kind of went through classes with, she didn't believe in dieting because she had also had Linda Bacon. So the great thing was, in that program, there were so many people that had Linda Bacon as a teacher by that point, because a lot of us went through City College of San Francisco, and so a lot of us were on board with that. Like, oh, diets. Yeah. Gross. Ew. But also in San Francisco, you have the other side of it, which was a lot of healthism around food. I call it like the Michael Pollan syndrome, where, the foods, even if we don't believe in dieting, the food's got to be local and organic and gently massaged and, pastured and whatever. Like, the cows have to have therapists before we eat them. And, it was just like really extreme healthism. And that had become a part of my dieting before I quit. And so I was like still a little bit caught up in that, like, well, I still want organic food and I still want it to be local and sustainable and blah. So I was still a little bit in that mindset probably, but definitely very much like, I don't want to talk about weight loss. And I had stopped dieting, and I was like gaining weight because, you know what, my body did not want to be thin. There was a moment when I gave up dieting. I thought, oh, maybe I'll still stay this size because I've been this size or close to this for 16 years. No, I am not a thin person by nature. And we know that dieting really throws off weight regulation. So I've probably gained back even a little more than I ever would have been because of that. But definitely I did not want to do any kind of weight loss. And I remember when I got to my internship here in Los Angeles, I was panicked because, the dietetics world is filled with people who believe in weight loss and that believe that fat bodies are wrong bodies. And I was panicked. And then in our orientation, I met Aaron, my podcast partner, and he was very much into intuitive eating. He was in a larger body at the time. And it was just like, I hear the angels singing, like, oh, I'm going to make it. I'm going to make it through this. And the nice thing about that internship was that a lot of the dietitians had been kind of influenced by him and by their own histories. And most of them at the time were not very diety. And so it was this wonderful sort of fortuitous experience where I didn't really have to teach a lot of weight loss during that time. And I just feel so lucky, that was supported, and that, everybody kind of was on board with how I felt about that. And it was so nice. So I've been lucky that I didn't have to dip my toes back into the weight loss paradigm too much.
Nice. That's awesome. And I forgot when I was chatting with Aaron to ask how you guys first met, and so I was like, I definitely want to find that out today. And so yeah, that's great to hear that was how you first came into contact. So how many years ago was that? Is that you saying 2013? That was
2012.
2012.
Yeah, so the beginning of my internship, 2012, and he was working. I know you mentioned this on your show, so I can say it, but he was working in their weight loss program at the time. And I remember specifically asking him, like, hey, like I always laugh and say that there's some kind of divide between like the Bay Area and Los Angeles. And everybody in Los Angeles knows about intuitive eating, but not so much health at every size. It's different now, but this was about 7 years ago. Everybody in the Bay Area knew about health at every size, but not so much intuitive eating. And I think it's because Linda Bacon was in the Bay Area. Elise Resch and Evelyn Tribole are down here in Los Angeles. And so it just sort of radiates out from those people, right? So he had said, I've heard about health at every size. I don't know. I haven't read the book. And I said, like, how are you doing intuitive eating, but you're in the weight loss program? Like, how do you square that? And so Aaron, he just shrugged his shoulders. He's like, I just do. So, which I was like, okay, let's just go with it. I'm not going to judge, and it was a few years later, we became like friends. And it was a few years later, I remember him saying like he was getting much more into the health at every size world. And he just said, I got to get out of here. This isn't the right thing for me anymore. And so I was like, great. And then he really just left and went into the eating disorder world. And, is a gigantic hero in those circles. And people love him, and he's great. He has so much great stuff to say on that. So that was sort of the trajectory of our relationship. And now we have a podcast together. So.
Yeah. So look, that I think all of that sets us up nicely in terms of giving your backstory. So how did you then get into, so I said at the top that I wanted to spend some time on diabetes because this is an area that you do a fair bit of work around. So how did you get into that?
Yeah. So after my internship, I was hired by the VA, which was great because I really loved it there. So was working with veterans. I started out inpatient in a spinal cord injury unit. I've since then moved to outpatient in a home-based primary care setting where I visit people in their home. And throughout, working with all of those patients, like many veterans have diabetes. There is a link to Agent Orange that's recognized now that people exposed to Agent Orange might have a higher risk for diabetes. So, I've had a lot of patients with diabetes over the years. And because I don't do weight loss, like you have to figure out, well, how, what does nutrition look like when you're not doing weight loss for somebody? And, weight loss, we know first of all, it doesn't last for most people. And it often makes people larger in the long run. So like if they're trying to lose weight for their diabetes, then it's going to have the exact opposite effect in the long run. Like they're just going to regain all that weight. And what we know is that you can actually improve blood sugars through a lot of different modes of self-care. So, changing the way you eat to some degree, getting movement, and then, a lot more beyond that. What's the stress level like? What's your, just sort of looking at the whole person. But I'm also working with people who are often financially strapped. Yeah. So you have to be really inventive around like, hey, you know what? Maybe fast food is your only way of getting food. You don't cook for yourself. you might not have a stove or a kitchen, so how do we look at that? And so, I've treated a lot of people, worked with a lot of people with diabetes over the years, and how I got into it more in my private practice was a few years ago. Rebecca Scritchfield, who's another dietitian, and she wrote the book Body Kindness.
Yeah, I've had her on the podcast, and yeah, people can check out that episode as well. I'll put it in the show notes.
Great. And and we had met at a conference, and we kind of knew each other, and she's been super supportive, and she sort of called up and said, hey, like, do you want to do something around diabetes? It's just not being addressed as much as it should be. And I was like, okay, sounds good. And so what we started to do was run support groups, because the big problem in diabetes care is that when somebody gets a diagnosis of, say, pre-diabetes or diabetes, the first thing, if they're in a larger body, the first thing the doctor says is, well, you have to lose weight. Except we know that doesn't work for most people. Most people can lose weight in the short term, but in 3 to 5 years, everybody regains all the weight, and sometimes more. And so we wanted to sort of provide this health at every size oriented support group for people with any sort of, diabetes, but also like pre-diabetes, really any sort of metabolic related condition, like could have been hypertension or cholesterol, anything, PCOS. And so we started running these virtual groups, and they were small groups. And we found that people were so grateful for having the space to sort of learn non-diet stuff and be supported in non-diet ways of caring for themselves, that it really was something that was needed. And so what we've done since then is we're still working on, we're going to probably launch it pretty soon, but we've expanded the groups into sort of an online subscription program with online content, and also the support groups, because people really need those. So in a monthly support group, because what we found was, we would do it over 4 weeks, and I think people just needed more time to kind of, with the support of dietitians and other people to help make changes if they wanted to make changes. Yeah. So that is sort of what we're doing. It's called Self-Care for Diabetes. And we can put a link in the show notes as well. Maybe just if people want to sign up and find out more. Should be launching early in the new year. And I also see people, because of that, I've also somehow become the sort of go-to dietitian in the area for like anybody that has like an eating disorder and also diabetes. So I see a lot of people that have, say, binge eating disorder and pre-diabetes or a diabetes diagnosis. And you can do great things without recommending weight loss or pursuing weight loss. Often when people's, blood sugars, often when people start to eat in a much more regular way, because what I find is my clients with binge eating disorder and any kind of overeating issues, they don't actually have an overeating issue. They're actually starved through the day. This has been my typical experience with clients, where they're just not eating breakfast, and then they're skipping lunch, and then you're like, I don't understand why I'm so hungry at night. I'm like, well, you do have to eat as a human. And so what we find is when they start to eat regular meals through the day, and it almost doesn't matter what they're eating, just their meal pattern starts to even out, their blood sugars get a little bit better. Yeah. And so that's been a great thing, to be able to work with people who the only thing they've ever been told their whole lives is lose weight, and it's never worked for them. They've tried, and it's never worked long term for them, and now they have diabetes. Like, we can't ask them to try that again. It's a poor intervention, and so it's been really gratifying to be able to offer that to people.
Nice. So look, I would like to just go through some of the stuff that you cover as part of that course, and just talk a little bit about sort of diabetes and some of the information that you give out. So just kind of backing up to start with, like, do you want to just describe, if I think most people have an idea of what diabetes is, or like a rough idea, but can you just talk about like what diabetes is and what pre-diabetes is and what's type 1 and type 2, just so that I guess people are on the same page when we start going through this?
Yeah, absolutely. So diabetes, I'll talk about type 2 diabetes because it's much more common. Okay. So that is usually something that tends to be diagnosed more in adulthood and often older. It is a chronic condition. Once you have diabetes, you always have diabetes. Your body is just not using the sugar from food, the carbohydrate from food, the way it should be, basically. So you've got your cells that are becoming sort of resistant to the insulin, perhaps, and then so insulin takes sugar into the cells, and if it's not getting into the cells, it's hanging out in the bloodstream, and our bodies don't like to have a lot of sugar in the bloodstream. It needs to have some, but not a lot, and so it'll build up and kind of cause a lot of problems. And in the meantime, you're not getting the energy into your body that you need to. And so what you end up with is sort of high blood sugar, and that's how they tend to diagnose it. So you can do a fasting blood sugar. They also diagnose it with the hemoglobin A1C. That's sort of primarily the way they tend to be diagnosing it now.
Okay.
Your hemoglobin A1C is a measure of your blood sugars over 3 months. So if that is over... Oh, look at me. I've forgotten the numbers. I think it's over 6.2% here. It's different in different countries, too. So, which gives you a little kind of view into how how things are, it's just not a cut and dried thing necessarily. And so often when somebody has diabetes, they might need medication to help get that blood sugar into their cells and out of their bloodstream. You can also do a lot around, I'm going to say diet, but really what I mean is your pattern of eating or your way of eating. You can do a lot with movement to help blood sugar. And I can talk in a minute about all the other things that we cover, because, there's a lot of different ways that your blood sugar can go up. It's not just eating, and it's not just lack of movement, but like stress impacts it, and shame impacts stress. And so that's type 2 diabetes. And it's different from type 1 diabetes in that is an autoimmune disease in which the body, they used to call it juvenile diabetes because it was diagnosed, in young people usually, although people can get it when they're older as well. The body attacks the beta cells in the pancreas, which are what releases the insulin or produces the insulin. And so they eventually have no insulin left, and they become dependent on exogenous insulin, meaning they have to inject it into their body. And so they differ a little bit, because somebody with type 2 diabetes might not become dependent on insulin. They could if it progresses, because it is a progressive condition, but they might never become insulin dependent or need to use insulin, versus somebody with type 1 who does require injections of insulin to be able to live. And so that's the difference. And I would say, I was just on another podcast the other day, and we were sort of talking about like the shame around type 2 diabetes versus type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes does tend to be diagnosed in younger people. It can happen to a person of any size. And I think generally there's no shame kind of around getting that condition. Versus type 2 diabetes, I think people tend to get blamed for getting this condition, like, oh, you've done something wrong and that's why you have it. And I didn't say earlier, but for type 2 diabetes, there's a strong genetic link. So often if somebody's at the doctor, they'll ask, do you have a family history of diabetes? They're asking that because that means it increases your likelihood of getting it. So, and it runs, I've just found out, it kind of runs on both sides of my family now, probably stronger on my mother's side. So, I have that family risk as well, that kind of interested me in the whole thing. And so that's sort of like a very probably clumsy overview of diabetes, and I'm pretty sure somebody else could tell it much better than I could, but that is sort of my lay person. Like when I have a patient or client, I say, did anybody tell you what diabetes is? And with my veterans, all of them just kind of shrug and they're like, sort of, it's like sugar. And that's their answer. And I'm like, let's talk about this, because we need you to understand, they need to understand what's happening in their body. And you want to use kind of simple terms. So that's sort of how I've gotten used to explaining it to some degree. I probably use sort of much easier terms when I'm talking to somebody maybe with like a lower education level or something like that. But just so, I want them to understand me, and if they have questions, they can ask. So, but yeah, I'm sure somebody else would describe it in a much more elegant way. But that is my explanation.
Okay, no, that makes sense, and it's interesting your comment about the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes and how that's thought about within society, where type 1 is an autoimmune condition and it's more thought about, well, that's just something that the body has done on its own, the person's not responsible, in inverted commas. And then type 2 diabetes is very much in the category of lifestyle disease, where people talk about it as if this is very preventable, and preventable meaning, well, if you'd done the right things, you wouldn't have necessarily got it, and then sort of making the person accountable or responsible for why they've ended up with type 2 diabetes. So yeah, I can understand how it gets like felt like that and talked about like that, and then the shame or guilt or whatever that then gets attached to ending up with that condition.
Yeah, and that's why in our program, the first module is, help with shame resilience, right? Because people have been told this is your fault, and that's how people are sort of coming into our groups. Like, I feel blamed for this. Many people would be in larger bodies, and they felt like this is somehow my fault, or even if they knew it wasn't their fault, it's like, I've been told it's my fault, and nobody can flourish with, that much shame around something that's like not their fault at all, hanging around for them. So we really talk about, shame resilience and sort of recognizing shame thoughts and how to hold yourself, in those moments. Because, that's, you can't, if you want to make changes or you need to make changes, it's just so you can't really shame yourself into that.
Yeah.
Some people maybe are successful at doing that, but most people might do it for a while and then they just, I think there's a sort of saving mechanism that comes in. It's like, I don't want to do that. Screw that, So yeah, we spend a lot of time on shame in our program.
And look, I completely agree with that. I was having a call with someone before we started recording this and just talking about just why I think fear is a terrible long-term motivator, and the same with shame. Like, if you've got to keep up negative feelings consistently to help you do something, at some point, like, I'm just feeling tired with this. So I know when I had Rebecca on the podcast, we talked about like spiraling up and getting people to find the positives and to find their strengths and getting them to a better place through that. And that is much more sustainable and is much more helpful than getting people down on themselves as a mode of changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just can't. I think Reagan Chastain is a great fat activist that I have followed for years, and I know now, and she's always said you can't hate yourself healthy. Yeah. And I truly believe that. Like, we don't want to take care of something we're, upset or ashamed about, So, and just knowing there's like no reason to have shame, I think, around diabetes, even if you caused it yourself, which is, I doubt most of us have the power to be able to bring disease on ourselves. But, even if you did cause it yourself, it's just a condition that people get, right? So there's no reason to have shame around it. And it's unfortunate that, people are encountering shame in the doctor's office. Yeah. And it's really paralyzing them, and they can't move forward.
Yeah. Definitely. And what are the symptoms that clients are typically getting that lead them to that diagnosis of diabetes? Or is it simply that they're in the doctor's office, the doctor tests them and says, hey, by the way, you've got diabetes?
Yeah, I think a pretty normal test to be run here is an A1C. And I have had young friends who've had it run and no history of diabetes in the family. So it's just a pretty standard lab test that people run here, or doctors run here. And I often think too that it's kind of a funny story. My partner is a thin person, and he'd never had his A1C taken. And he's so funny. He just went in and said, like, I want to have my A1C done. They're like, why? You're not overweight or you're not obese. And their words, not mine. He's like, so I should know if I have it or not. So they, he demanded having a test, versus somebody who goes in a higher weight body. I think that they automatically assume that there's going to be some blood sugar abnormality, and they run that test. And so people are probably getting diagnosed because of weight stigma to some degree, which is ironic. I mean, if you have diabetes, you want to know, because, then you want to get appropriate treatment for it. Yeah. But I do think that people in higher weight bodies are probably getting diagnosed more. And I think people that are thinner are being missed. And I think of a couple of patients I've had through the VA who were thin, developed diabetes, and suddenly had these really dramatic overnight things happen to them. Like one gentleman basically lost kidney function, in a very short time. And I think, he said, he had a very short-term memory. So I don't know how long he'd had diabetes, actually, thinking about it. But it was sort of a surprise thing. And he was thin. And I don't think anybody ever thought he would have diabetes. And somebody else, literally kind of lost his eyesight overnight with, snowflakes developing in his eyes. They call them snowflakes. And they improved, but I think again, he was in a thinner body. I'm just wondering if he was missed being diagnosed. And so I think using weight, unfortunately, as a way to diagnose people is terrible, because we're going to underdiagnose thinner people that might have diabetes, and, possibly overdiagnose larger people, in that they might have like a borderline pre-diabetic A1C, and it's like you have to go on a diet immediately. I see a lot of people like that. Their A1Cs aren't that high. They may never develop diabetes, but sort of the panic button's been hit for them, and so they might benefit from some changes, and at that point, there's no reason to panic, but the panic button has been pressed. So, so that I think is why and how it's getting diagnosed here. I think it's a pretty uneven application.
Wow, that's super interesting. I'd never even thought of that, of how many people in thinner bodies are potentially getting missed, because doctors just don't even think about diagnosing it. They just the same way as with people in larger bodies, they take a look at someone and make some assumptions, and then they decide based on those assumptions. And so if the assumption is, they're thinner, they can't have diabetes. I know when I had Julie Duffy-Dillon on the podcast and we were talking about PCOS, this was a kind of similar thing, where she said that when they did a huge amount of research on PCOS, it was like it affects people all across the weight spectrum, and it doesn't even particularly skew towards people being in heavier bodies. But if you asked most doctors, or even just most people in the lay public who've heard about PCOS, the first thing they would probably think is, this is something that happens to people in larger bodies. I think that's just fascinating.
Yeah, I say we've had people with PCOS in our group, and they also felt shame about having that because they were in a larger body. And I just wanted to say about the weight stigma piece, we did have one person in our group said, well, my doctor said I had pre-diabetes. And we're like, what is that? And none of us knew what that was. And what we realized is that person was probably a victim of weight stigma at the doctor. It's like, if your A1C is in the normal category, that's called not diabetes, So, but because this person was in a larger body, we think that she was sort of a victim of weight stigma, essentially. Like pre diabetes, you're in a larger body, so you're just going to get it. So I just wanted to sort of end that part on that story.
Yeah, wow, that is just a horrible term to be using, and just shows all someone's assumptions if they're labeling something in that way, because it's clearly not showing up on a blood test, but it's like, oh yeah, definitely from looking at you, I know that this is going to be your end point, so I'm gonna tell you about it. And so I know with intuitive eating that gentle nutrition is the last principle. And so when you're either working with clients or when you're doing the program that you do with Rebecca, are you talking about nutrition more upfront, or is it kind of still left to the end?
We kind of hit that in the middle of the program, because I think people want to sort of start to know, they get a little itchy around, but what do I do with food?
Yeah.
But we do preface it with a module on mindful eating first, because we're not taking people through the whole intuitive eating process. So it's not a complete, like, here's how to do intuitive eating. But we do talk about the mindful eating component, because we do think that is a really useful tool to use in, honoring hunger and fullness signals and preferences. And we do talk about intuitive eating. And we do say, like, if you have an eating disorder, really treating the eating disorder comes first, because if you are still sort of in the middle of like having binge eating disorder and you're not feeling good about all foods, that all foods can fit, I think that the foundation is not there to be able to make any nutrition changes. You really do need to believe that all foods can fit. And I do believe that even in diabetes, that all foods can fit. It might just be you have to eat them in a slightly different way or in a different pattern. But, restricting foods doesn't tend to help people. So we do say, like, kind of, think about your eating disorder first. If you need treatment for that, call us, call somebody else, get the help you need. But that sort of needs to come first to some degree, in order to heal that relationship to food. And so we kind of hit in the middle, but we also have a very flexible, you can skip that module, go on to another one, leave it to the end. There's no reason to do things in order, necessarily. We say, look at the titles, whatever is affecting you the most right now, you can, do that one first. And so there's a lot of flexibility in that. And so we did put it sort of in the middle. But again, it can be sort of tackled last. And again, if somebody's not, ready to hear nutrition information, they don't have to listen to that. There's many other ways that you can perform self-care that's going to be supportive, not just for diabetes, but for anybody, really. Yeah. We do talk about nutrition a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, and something you made reference to earlier in your own story with Weight Watchers, is just the importance of structure. And even with the clients I work with, like, yes, it will vary depending on the person, but a lot of the time that is where we start, because that is just the foundation of everything. If eating is all over the place and it's chaotic, if you can bring some structure into that, and that can be done fairly early on, then it's a real that one change can make a really big difference. And so it's often trying to find, okay, what are the leverages or the levers that make the biggest difference to start with, and that one is often one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. We spend more time talking about really structure than what you should eat. We're not actually telling you what you should eat. We know that fruits and vegetables and fiber are all good things for everybody, and especially for, blood sugar control. And, we're sort of, what I find is most people come into this it's not a knowledge deficit around nutrition, necessarily. But unfortunately, what they've been taught is to diet, and that's not necessarily nutrition. And so it has led to really chaotic eating for people. And so, I'm a huge fan of structure. Like, we need to get fed regularly. Many of us have jobs where we have to eat in a fairly structured manner. Like, you can't just have lunch whenever you feel like it at a job. And so So, and I also believe that hunger and fullness still, play a factor in that, and that you can have structure and still have normal hunger and fullness cues. And I find that when we introduce structure for people, that I call it appetite training. Like basically your appetite starts to fall along that structure, so that, you're getting hungry at your lunchtime. And I'm a big fan of Ellen Satter's eating competence model, and I draw a lot from that as well as intuitive eating. And that really spoke to me when I stopped dieting, like, oh, structure, that's still a good thing to have, kind of thing. And so, we talk more about that and meal mixes, what looks like to sort of play with the macronutrients on your plate for a balance that works for you. And so it's very much about being experimental and learning what works for the individual. And it's not a one size fits all, you must eat this way. It's very much like, find out what works for you. Right. And that is maybe novel for people as well. And it can be difficult because it's gray area. And sometimes people are like, just tell me how to eat. And it's like, I could tell you how to eat, but you're not going to do it. You know that. You're going to do it for 5 minutes. And then, it has to come from you. So the individual. So that's where I think that our approach is fairly novel as well. It's really helping you build the skill to learn how to care for yourself in a way that works for the individual.
Yeah. And that, I mean, what you're describing is also the way that I work with clients, because like you and I can both have a huge amount of nutrition knowledge, but people react to that differently. Like I can talk to clients who tell me about, this is the breakfast I do best on. I'm like, gosh, if I had that for breakfast, I'd feel terrible, and vice versa. And, and both of us could be having highly nutritious breakfasts. It's just, we prefer different things. We perform better on different things. Someone could be like, oh, when I have, I don't know, like chocolate, for example, I do better when I have that just on its own. And someone else is like, oh, I do better when I have that as part of an actual meal. And so when I'm giving, like if someone's like, can you tell me some nutritional advice? It's more of a, okay, well, this thing could work, or there's this other thing that could work. And why don't you try these things out and see what you notice for your body? Because there isn't, and as you were saying, like trying to get people to understand that there isn't just one way of doing this, and there's lots of different ways of doing this, and not every way is going to work for them. There's some ways that will work for them, there's others that won't, but they then have to have the ability and learn the ability to listen to their body, to be able to pay attention, to prioritize food or the experience of eating enough so that they're able to get that feedback. And that all of these things just take time, and that there isn't just one easy handout that you can give them that is just like, oh, this is all you need to do.
That's it. That's exactly how I work with my individual clients as well. Like this is, they say, I just want you to tell me what to eat. I'm like, well, it's not really going to work. We got to figure out what works for you, right? Like you said, I can offer like, well, hey, if you're getting really hungry immediately after, what about some more protein? Do you want to play with that, and see what that's like? And I think for some people who have been on the diet cycle so many times, that feels kind of relieving to some degree, where they're like, oh, I get to choose, and I get to choose what I like. And, I just wouldn't want to work any other way. Just a cut and dried approach is just, we know this doesn't work really. And everybody has their individual preferences. And we want to honor those.
Yeah. And I think you said for some clients, they feel relief with that. And I think that is definitely the case with some people. And then for others, it's completely paralyzing, because there's the realization of, I genuinely don't know what I want. I don't know what I like, because I've become so numb to all of those things, because I've had to over the years of, you've got to follow this list and you can't have that list. And so someone has just lost the ability to be able to even understand what they like or what they want. And that's not a permanent thing. That can be relearned. But yeah, for every person who feels free in that moment from that realization, there's the other client that feels utterly terrified and doesn't know where they're going to go with that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love those clients too that are so like, oh, what do I eat? I'm like, well, we're going to do some deep dives into what you like. So it's kind of a fun challenge, but yeah, they're in like total disarray of like, I don't even know what to give, they'll skip meals because it's just terrifying to figure out what to eat. And then, for my clients, sometimes they'll binge later. I'm like, well, we know that you probably like that binge food. So can we work it in earlier in the day? So that's definitely a fun challenge to have in a client, I think.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the mindfulness piece as being a big part of what you're teaching. So what aspects of mindfulness with eating do you teach?
Really sort of mostly kind of paying attention and sort of calming down, permission to eat. I start with, I think that's like the number one thing that we need to have, and sort of taking a deep breath before meals, and then sort of, seeing if you can tune into the food and the taste of it. Eventually learning your own hunger and fullness signals, if those are kind of dampened for you. I'm trying to think. It's kind of it's a pretty good module. And we recorded it a while ago, so I'm trying to remember what's in it. It's really, we try not to overwhelm people because, ultimately, we want them to get the point that it's about sort of being present with the food rather than being distracted. And really just being curious about what your hunger and fullness signals look like, and that it's not, this isn't cut and dried. This is experimental and just a skill that you practice, and that over time it may change for you too, your experience. But really just sort of being present with the food is a big one. And, we know that people eat with a lot of distractions as well. And I'm just a big fan of saying, can we put the distractions away? And when I'm working with clients individually as well, like that's when you see where all the feelings come up. So what we expect fully when people sort of start this mindful eating practice is that, they might become aware of emotions that they have around food. Yeah. And just to sort of note them. And so really it's not a super deep dive into mindful eating, in that they'll spend 3 months trying to learn different aspects of that, but really just kind of early steps of listening to hunger and fullness, if you can sense them, paying attention to your food, and then the permission and just sort of doing some deep breathing.
Nice. And then non-food suggestions. I mean, this is, you made references earlier on, and I'm also a big believer in this, that food and nutrition are an important part, but I think they are given way too much weight in terms of their importance. And this is for diabetes, but for basically health in general. So what are the other things that you're talking about as part of the course that, or with individual clients, that can then be helpful for blood sugar regulation outside of food?
Yeah, we talk about sleep being a big one. And that's what we started out in our groups, the 4-week groups initially. We would talk about sleep, movement, sort of mindful eating and nutrition. And then we would weave in a lot of other information, just depending on what problems people were bringing to the group. So we're definitely, talking a lot about sleep and improving sleep patterns. And, getting help if you think you have sleep issues. We talk about, the self-compassion for shame and building self-compassion, because I think that's something that people really struggle with, right? Is self-compassion, period. We're always saying, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. And shooting all over ourselves does not really work to get things done. We talk about making sense of your blood sugar, labs and taking blood sugars in a way that doesn't feel judgmental, but that can just be information and feedback, so that, you can make decisions about, well, did this meal work for me? Or do I need to mix it up a little bit? Do I need to change sort of the mix of that? We talk about really defining your values and living according to those. And so, it's really important for somebody to know what's valuable or what's a value for them. And then how do you sort of live that? How do you bring that through in your self-care? The mindful eating, the nutrition part of it, building boundaries with people, because people are getting a lot of diet advice. So, sort of how to come up with boundaries around that. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember everything. There's 14 of them. Some of them are shorter, so it's not like 14 hours of information. Some of them tend to be, a little bit shorter. Movement is a huge sort of component of this. But talking about movement and finding out what's enjoyable for you, what's fun, what do you like, what can you make work for your life versus the advice of like, you just must exercise, which I have so many people in my practice that they really struggle with exercise resistance. They've been traumatized by exercise since they were young. And they're like, I don't want to do it because it's always been about weight. It's always been about doing something they don't enjoy. So, we have sort of a gentle way of like easing you into thinking about movement. Stress is another sort of big module and like how stress can affect your blood sugars in your life. And then what can you sort of do to help yourself around that? And those are sort of the big ones. And we talk a little bit about like weight inclusive care and sort of how to bring it all together and commit to yourself. And so those are sort of the main ones. You can see it's not just about food, right? Like there's so many different ways to care for yourself. So if you don't want to hear about the nutrition piece, move on and just think, okay, what else do I need? And we have like a self-assessment that's going to help people sort of figure out where they need help. And I think that's the big part, right? Because not everybody comes with the same problems. They need to know what can I do to help myself, with what I have now. And so we think that that's going to be really helpful because this is about building like, what is my self-care plan going to look like? And where do I need help and support?
Yeah, definitely. And like of some of those things that you touched on, I mean, I have mentioned so many times on this podcast just how important I think sleep is and how much I prioritize it because I know how much it impacts on me and how I perceive the world and how I'm able to function. And I know just in Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep book, he starts out in the beginning talking about just how much improper sleep then impacts on blood sugar levels. And I think there was some example, like if you disrupt someone's sleep by even just like 2 or 3 days, you can get them into pre-diabetic blood sugar levels just because of the lack of sleep and how important that is. So I think, the sleep piece, and then the other one connected to that is the better sleep that you have, that has a direct impact on the kind of foods that you crave, your ability to listen to hunger and fullness. And so I think if we're talking about getting structure in place and having that side of things working, I would again say sleep can be so important.
Around the sleep, too, that a lot of people might have sleep problems, right, that need treatment.
Yeah.
And I always want to recommend, like, could you go and do a sleep study? But the problem with getting sort of tested for sleep apnea is that there's so much weight shame in that process. And that the first thing they say to you if you have sleep apnea, before you even get diagnosed, the HMO, the medical system I'm in, you go to a class and they say, well, the first thing you need to do is lose weight. But if you have sleep apnea and you get the machine, then you'll sleep better and you should be able to lose weight. And it's like, stop, like, we don't know if that's true or not. And so a lot of people avoid going to get tested for sleep problems, I think, because they are likely to be weight shamed and told that this is kind of your fault. And whether it is or it isn't, it might be. But again, we don't know a long-term, cure for turning a larger body into a thinner body permanently. We don't know how to do that and especially we might make the problem worse. I'll put worse in quotes. in terms of if they want somebody to lose weight and then they might end up larger in the long run, that's what a diet will do for you. And so, it's unfortunate that people aren't really getting the help they need around sleep disorders.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had a number of clients who, when they've had it diagnosed, have then been told, as you said, they need to lose weight. And also, though, when they've started using the CPAP machine, how beneficial it has been. And they're just like, oh my gosh, like I just wake up feeling so much better than I have in so long. Like it just really shows them how much sleep was impacting on them when they just didn't realize. Like they're like, okay, I don't think I'm sleeping well, or I feel a bit like under the weather when I wake up, or I just don't have great energy. But it's by then starting to use the CPAP machine that they're like, wow, it is really night and day with how I'm feeling now since starting to use this.
Yeah, and in full disclosure, this year I was diagnosed with mild sleep apnea, and I'm feeling the results of treatment. I have so much more energy through the day. It's like kind of shocking. I could not use the CPAP machine, but my sleep apnea was so mild as to I could probably have ignored it, which I didn't want to do. But there's also something called so I only have sleep apnea on my back when I sleep on my back. So the idea is to keep me off of my back in the middle of the night. And you can buy devices that will you kind of strap on to yourself to do that. But there's also a very DIY way to do it, which is to put a tennis ball in a sock and pin it onto the back of your t-shirt while you sleep. And it really works. But just wanted to say that because to have better sleep is amazing, to wake up feeling like not so exhausted. And so when I have somebody saying to me, like, I am so exhausted in the morning, I'm like, let's get you tested, let's see if you can get a sleep test. And it's, I give them strategies for getting through the whole process without being completely destroyed by the weight shaming. We kind of strategize on what will work for them to get through the process. But yeah, the just being able to sleep better is so, health giving, I feel.
Yeah. Totally. And as someone who has a 2-year-old child, I know the difference between good sleep and not so good sleep because it happens regularly. And then, you mentioned about movement. I think this it is so beneficial for so many areas of life, but we just need to change the way that we think about movement. Like movement can be so many of the little things that we do on a regular basis, or the things that we scoff at as not being sweat inducing. So like, why would you bother going for a walk, or why would you bother doing some gardening, or just so many things that people really enjoy, and they would probably enjoy them a lot more if they didn't feel like they should be doing more than just them, or I'm going for this walk, but I really should be going in and doing a boot camp. And I think that if we can change the way that this is approached, and I know this is the case with a lot of clients, it's like, okay, what do you really enjoy? What do you enjoy doing in terms of moving your body, that if you found out in 10 years' time that it had no health benefits, you'd still want to keep doing it? And you're like, let's if you have any of those, let's start there, because that can be a really great way of being able to move your body without all of the the beliefs around exercise, or the baggage around exercise that someone may be bringing to the table with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like just the baggage that people bring with exercise. And I kind of hate using the word exercise, right? Like that's like capital E exercise. Like it really brings up images for people of like, oh, I've got to be sweating or lifting weights or whatever. I'm like, oh, you really don't. Like any kind of movement is great. And I'm like, hey, let's count what you're already doing. You go to the grocery store and walk around the aisles, right? You have to do laundry. Maybe you have to go up and down stairs for that. Like all of that counts as movement. And I say, like, let's give ourselves credit for what we're already doing and see if there are ways to include more of that in your life, if that feels good for you. But yeah, just like a walk. And one of my clients actually said to me, like, I really didn't want to walk because I felt like I had to like pound the pavement and go really fast. And what she found one day is if she just strolled and enjoyed things, that she actually enjoyed doing that and felt like she wanted to do that again. And it's like, yes, that is so much better than nothing at all, right? But that's, you found a way to do it and make it work. There's just all movement is going to be beneficial. But, you know, finding out what those blocks are for people, because I think, again, people have been so traumatized by exercise, and they're like, I want to exercise, but I don't know why I don't want to exercise. And I'm like, I get it. So, you know, it's become just this draconian punishment for you, and they don't want to do it. So we really, you know, I do a lot in my private practice with helping people sort of, you know, move through exercise resistance, and that's been really helpful.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember the exact details, but there was this really great paper that looked at people who were already doing a fair bit of movement. I think it was maids that were working in a hotel or something along those lines. And they basically, they split them into two groups. So they had a control group, and then they had the group that they talked to. And the group they talked to, they were like, look, you are on your feet for however many hours a day, 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day. You're doing so much movement by cleaning the rooms and changing bedding and all of this. And then they kind of just let them to it, and then checked with them again in like a month's time. And for whatever reason, I mean, we don't really understand a lot of this stuff, but because they now started to think that what they were doing as a job was actually movement, as opposed to constantly feeling like, oh, I don't have time to get any exercise done because I'm doing this job all the time, they had like remarkable changes within themselves. And I'm blanking on what the changes were. Maybe there was some weight loss, because that's probably what the study was focusing on, but it was like changes in terms of blood sugar levels, changes in terms of like lots of different markers. And nothing had changed in their life apart from the fact that they were just told that actually what they were doing was counted as movement and it was helpful for their body. And so, yeah, I am a big advocate of just getting more like neat, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, like more small movement into people's lives, and for them to understand that that is really beneficial, because that's the majority of movement that we've done through our evolutionary history.
Yes, absolutely. And it's sad that, I think the 80s came along and just ruined it for everybody, right? Like Jane Fonda and her exercise videos, and, it's all of a sudden you've got to be doing all this. But we want to think about people who are on their feet all day and kind of moving for their job. Like, and then they feel guilty about like, well, I should be getting exercise. It's like, well, hold on, you're moving all day. Why aren't we counting that? Oh, that doesn't count. I didn't sweat enough, or my heart rate didn't get up. And, so really, I think it's so important to give credit where credit is due, like that, that neat exercise, right? Or that neat movement, that people are doing, and people are probably moving way more than they actually realize too. And they need to feel good about that, because that is taking care of yourself, even if it's not something you're doing on purpose. That's just how you live, right? And that's how you do it. So, I really, just telling somebody to exercise does not work, and we don't do that in our program. We're inviting you to explore this if you want to.
And you said a lot of the work you started out doing this was with the VA, and you said obviously there's a lot of stress, but I would imagine huge amounts of trauma and PTSD. And so is there a lot of overlap between that and diabetes? And then B, do you talk about that a lot with either clients or in the course, or are you referring out so that people are getting support in that area, with the intention of it, helping their mental abilities and emotional life and how they deal with life, but also because it is going to be benefiting their diabetes?
Right. So I think that within the VA, I think there's still very much this. I'll start out by saying this. There's very much this traditional model of, they have diabetes, go give them go give them nutrition education. It's like, yeah, okay, we are going to do that, right? Of course, that's available. But I happen to be so lucky in the team that I work on. It's home-based primary care, and we are a team, a pretty close team, and we go out to the home and do visits in the home for people. And so on our team, we have a psychologist, we have an occupational therapist, we have, nurse practitioners, we have the dietitian, so, and we're all working closely together. And it's been amazing because, we'll talk about like, yeah, we've given them nutrition education, but hey, this thing has come up where they used to depend on their wife to help get their medication, but that relationship is kind of going south. So we have to figure out other ways to help that person get their medication. And there's amazing tools, like there's like timed pill boxes and timed, all sorts of things. So as our team, which is a pretty respected team within the VA too, because it really helps prevent hospitalizations, keeps veterans in the home longer. Our team, I think, is this amazing model of like an interdisciplinary team where we're like, hey, this person's going through a lot of stress right now. Can the psychologist maybe give a visit, and I'll just go and talk to the psychologist and say, hey, he's really going through this tough time. Can you maybe like go and see him kind of thing? Or connect with this person, or, somebody else will approach us and say, hey, he's, really struggling with getting enough food. Can you help out there kind of thing? So, so within our little program at the VA, we had this really multidisciplinary approach. And I think that's just, we all sit in the same area. So we all just see each other. We all just talk weekly about the patients. And so I think that, and they also have, the clinics that sort of operate in a similar model. So I do think that there is definitely an interdisciplinary approach throughout the VA. I just happen to have worked in this little area for the last 4 years, and it's been amazing to see. Like we do, it's kind of very, very much a whole health kind of situation. So yeah, we're definitely looking at all the factors in somebody's life, and a lot of the time we're dealing with somebody who doesn't have a lot of money. The main thing we're trying to do is figure out, how do we get you food that you need, and how do we get you the care that you need, and how do we support that? So that's been a very fortuitous kind of like a nice team to work in. And yeah. I do think that does sort of, resonate through the rest of the VA.
Okay, nice. To be able to offer that kind of support for people who are just so in need, I think that's wonderful. And so one of the other areas I wanted to just touch on before we close up is, like, I know you do work with children and childhood feeding problems. So yeah, do you want to talk a little about this?
I don't do it as much as I did before, just because I moved more into helping people with binge eating disorder, kind of overeating issues, and diabetes, and people on higher weight bodies and adults. And but yeah, I feel fairly passionate about childhood feeding. My idea was really, when people approach me like, oh, my child has this eating issue. And when we sort of look deeper down into it, it's like the child doesn't have an eating issue so much as there are problems in the feeding dynamics. And, when I've worked with some parents, what I've often also found is that the parent themselves have eating issues as well that might be coming, to the table a little bit. And so really the work I have done in the past was much more about parent coaching than it was working with the child. And I don't really see adolescents for eating disorders. It's just kind of not my niche right now. So I refer to my brilliant friends that are in the area for those kinds of things. But I have moved a little bit away from childhood feeding, but I am so passionate about it because it's sort of how I grew up eating. And I see like, oh gosh, there's just so many good ways to do it, but it's often a struggle to sort of work with parents to get to see that, you might have to change in order to get your child's eating to change. And that is often a big struggle, I find.
Okay, so the parents weren't so receptive to hear that. Okay, this is not just a child thing. This is a very much a dynamic of your relationship and potentially your relationship with food being reflected upon through the child, and just like not wanting to own up with that or see their own problems.
Yeah, it's actually one of the reasons I'm kind of moving away from that work is that I think parents, I mentioned earlier, I think parents feel an incredible amount of like guilt all the time.
Yeah.
And I feel, that is unfortunate because again, everybody's doing the best that they can. But I think often parents will show up, and this is, I have only worked in Los Angeles as a dietitian. So I do sometimes think, this tends to be a very orthorexic city, where people are like, my child must eat broccoli. My child must eat all the vegetables. And it's like, oh, well, that's not going to work at all, just forcing somebody to eat. And so getting them to understand like, hey, we don't know what your child's weight is going to do. But this is how we best support eating. Often I find parents don't want to hear that. And again, maybe part of it is an LA thing where it's like, God forbid you have a fat child, right? Or a fat adult child eventually, like somehow that might be the worst thing. But that might be everywhere. I mean, not just LA, but I do remember my mother being so supportive, and I'm so grateful for her to be supportive of, have been supportive of my body size growing up. I really do think that helped, even though she herself dieted. But going back to, really it's with childhood feeding, it's like it's a group project. It's, parents need to sort of be the people in charge often. And I think they struggle with that because I think you want to just think, well, this is just a kid problem and we'll go and get it fixed. And unfortunately, it takes a multidisciplinary approach. It takes all the caregivers involved and the child and everybody, right? So, but it is something that I do feel like I love Ellen Satter's division of responsibility in feeding. Like, I do think that is just the gold standard for how we should feed kids. And if people are wanting to know, I'm sure you've done an episode on this.
I did one with Paige Smathers where we did a whole episode on feeding dynamics, and we talked a lot about Ellen Satter.
Yeah, I love her. So and her book, I use her book, and I use that model actually for, the eating competence model for adults, but it's not that different, right? In a way. So, but yeah, I eventually sort of moved away from doing parent coaching, but I will still do it if somebody's like, kind of like, I can commit to this, and at this point I would really only coach parents and not see the children necessarily. I just have found in my experience, a lot of it is easily identifiable things that we can change in the feeding dynamic. Yeah. And so, but I've moved, like I said, I've moved more into my niche of like binge eating disorder, overeating, working with people in larger bodies is really my jam, and a little less with, actually a lot less with parents and children.
Okay. Well, look, I'm sorry then that we didn't get enough time or much of a chance to talk about binge eating disorder. So maybe we're going to have a part 2 to talk about that. But look, this has been a wonderful conversation. Where can people be going to find out more about you? Where do you want to point them to online?
Yeah, so mostly my website is where I'm active, daretonotdiet.com. And then but you can find my podcast there as well. But my podcast is called Dietitians Unplugged. And we're on all the places that you can listen to podcasts. And I'm on Facebook too, not so much. So I'm not so much into the social media. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on Twitter. Just on Facebook. But really, if you want to get in touch with me, just go to my website and use the contact form. And I love talking to people. So, so that's mostly where people can find me.
Perfect. Well, look, I will put all of that in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation, getting to talk about diabetes and hearing your take on it. I think you're really doing wonderful work in this space.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks for having me on.
So that is it for the interview. Glenys, thank you so much for your time. I'm grateful that we were able to have this conversation. As I mentioned at the top of the show, 7 Health is currently taking on new clients. If you are struggling with dieting or disordered eating or body image issues or any of the topics that we cover on this show, then please get in contact. You can go to www.7-health.com/help, and I will then catch you next time.